Hi, I'm Spencer Lewis. I'm doing a project for my Python course, and today I'm going to be explaining to you guys a topic, pybind11, which is basically seamless operability between Python and C++. And so I'm going to have my slides up here so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. My slides will also be linked in the description of this video, and I'm also going to cut between to my coding examples so that I can show you guys on my computer. You won't really be able to see if I display it up on the screen very well. But the coding examples are also, like images of them are displayed in the slides as well. So you can look at that. Let's get started. So just a basic overview, pybind11 was started by Wenzel Jacob. If you Google pybind11, by the way, the first link is the GitHub link, so it'll have all of that information up there for you. But it's a header-only library that exposes C++ types in Python and vice versa. Today we're basically going to be talking about C++ integration into Python, not as much Python into C++. But it's meant to replace Boost, which is a really large and unnecessary dependency now. It was made a long time ago. And so the header library that pybind11 provides, much easier and much more lightweight, so it's better for computers nowadays. So here's a list of the supported compilers. Like I said, if you guys Google pybind11 and just go to that first GitHub link, these are all going to be listed there as well. If you have recently, like a pretty new computer, and you have a C++ compiler on there, you're probably going to be fine. If you don't have enough C++ compiler, I have a workaround linked, and like I said, the slides are linked in the description, so you guys can just check that. And these are all the different features that can be mapped to Python from C++. So there's a bunch here. I have two slides of them. Functions, instance methods, overloaded functions, enumerations, callbacks, iterators and ranges, custom operators, different like types, structs, stuff like that. We're not going to be going through everything today. I won't have enough time, but we're going to just kind of get started, and I'll show you guys some basic examples and stuff on how we can do some of these topics. We're going to start here with the prerequisites and the header. For my examples, we're just going to assume that I kind of have already installed all the prerequisites and everything, because like I said, we don't have a ton of time. It says you had to install Python dev, but the current version of Python that I had on my machine worked with it fine, and you obviously have to install CMake and then pybind11 itself. I would suggest if you're using Windows, using Visual Studio 2015 or newer, but any C++ compiler is going to work for you. And the two lines that you basically need to remember for every single .cpp file that you're going to be writing, that you're going to try and take what's in there and kind of move it over into Python, you need to include the pybind11 library in there. And then before you do your binding module, you're going to have your namespace py equals pybind11. And so speaking of that binding, we're going to start with just a very basic function and learn how to bind it. So this is just an add function. I know that in C++ you can just use the plus and that adds two numbers together, but for the sake of the argument and simplicity, we're just going to have this int add function that adds two numbers together, takes in two numbers and adds them together. And so to create that binding function, we're going to create our pybind11 binding module. And so this is going to go right below that namespace py equals pybind11 line. And this is also normally going to be put into a separate .cpp file, because normally, obviously, your code's going to be a lot larger. You're going to have a lot more to bind. And so you just want to keep everything organized. But you can see I just named it pybind11 underscore module. And then you're going to take the name of your .cpp file and then give that kind of like a variable name that you're going to use throughout the binding module. You just give this first line is the doc string, so that's just kind of describing what you're binding, and then you're going to define stuff below that. So this right here is the definition line, and you're going to be able to see it better in my example in just a second. But but that's the definition line for our add function.
All right, so here is our first example with just our basic adder function. You can see I have a lot of my code here in green. All that in my example file is going to be commented out. That's going to be used later. So right now we're just going to focus on our basic function so that you guys can see better. Our header file is included here in our pound include statement. And then we just have our int add function defined like you would normally in any C++ file. And then down below our code, we have our namespace pi equals pybind11, and then our pybind module. And you can ignore kind of everything below our add definition, but you can see our doc string is kind of describing what we are binding here. And then our definition line right here, it has our function name and then the address of the function, and then it has another little optional docstring definition right there. Okay, and that command line prompt that will bind the code, I actually have put in a make file that's in my build subdirectory right here. And so all I'll have to do to bind that, you guys can look at the slides to make sure you have the proper code, but I'll just do make. And then it has everything linked, build target example. So if I do then open a virtual environment in Python, I can import example. And then I can do, say, example.add 1 and 2. That'll put out 3. Example.add 100, 456, 556. And that's pretty much it for the first example.
So after our first kind of simple coding example, we can talk for a second about how we might be able to improve that. So there's a way that you can extract parameters to make the code easier to read, and easier to read code is always better code, especially when you're working in large groups, maybe on a large conversion of a CPP file into Python. So you can take default arguments, and you can kind of, using the pyarg function, are able to kind of spell it out for them in the code, because pybind11 doesn't do this automatically, but you can extract them using the py.arg function. And so another thing that you can do is when you're building your module, you can automatically add and export variables using the attr function. That creates attributes within the module that will be exported directly into Python. So this is just a simple sample attribute, and you can see, check on my slides because I know it's hard to see right here, that when I import example and then I do example.robinson, it'll export, or it'll return 42. And Robinson obviously wasn't something that was a part of my original .cpp file, but I can add it right in the module, and that can be utilized when converting and bringing it over into my Python code. All right, so now that we've gotten basic definitions down and the basic binding for like a basic function, we can move on to more object-oriented concepts. So this is just a basic class that I made in the example.cpp file. It's a class called pet. And so a pet has a name and it has a hunger variable that shows how hungry it is. And so there's also functions within that class that you can take the pet for a walk. You can get its name and you can get its hunger, because both of those you can see I put in the private section, which is going to come back in a little bit because you have to handle private variables in a little bit of a different way. So you can see here's the binding code for that pet module. And so the bindings to the pet class are just going to go in order. You're just going to do the dot definition and then the definition for the function. You can kind of see in the example, it's a pretty easy standard format. and you're going to want to initialize that class in the first line, do the rest of the definitions below it, and you're not going to do any of the semicolons until the very last line of your definition. You just do one semicolon, very end of the last line. And so that class creates bindings for a class or a struct type data structure. And then, like I said, the initialization is a convenience function that takes the types of a constructor's parameters as a template arguments and wraps them to the corresponding constructor. And so I'm going to take you guys and give you a little bit of an example in the Python terminal right now.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our second example. I'm going to talk about binding the class. So you can see here I have my class pet that has now been taken out of the comments, and so I have my initialization, my destructor, a couple of function definitions. So our pet has a name and hunger, which is just an integer, and the integer increases as the pet gets hungrier. Those are both private, and then so we can get the hunger or get the name here. And if we take our pet for a walk with this function go for a walk, then our hunger for our pet increases. So if we scroll down to look at the binding here, we have that py class underscore pet, and then our definitions underneath it. So this is what the definition of the initialization list is going to look like, and then our definitions for each of our functions. So let's test this out over here and see how that's going to work. We're going to make, I'm only getting that warning because of some of the stuff that I've commented out. And then we're going to do, we're going to open our Python virtual environment, and we are going to import example. And then we're going to create a pet p and give that pet name Molly. And a hunger, we'll just start it out at 1. All right, so if we print p, that's just telling us that we have an object at that address. So if we want to print the name of our pet, we would use our function getName, p.get underscore name. Oh, I'm sorry, p.get underscore name. I forgot my parentheses there. And then p.get hunger would give us our hunger. And then if we took our pet for a walk, for a walk, and then after we've gone for a walk, if we get the hunger, you can see it's increased by 1. All right, so you notice that when we would do p.print, it would just print that there was an object at a specific location. We can actually use a special method slot to specify how we would like p.print to look when we use it. So if I just take this code out, this underscore repr underscore is that special method slot, and you can return that specific string that you want to print out when you're using just your basic print function. So now if I go back to here, oh, you gotta take the semicolon off of there. If I go back to here and then make again, and then we'll open our virtual environment, import example, create another pet, and then print p, you can see it's printed out in the specified way that we wanted it to be.
All right, so now that we've talked about and done an example of how to make and bind a class, we can kind of discuss a little bit more about how to handle the information within the class. So using this class underscore definition underscore read write function, when we're in our binding module, we're able to access the data or like the variables inside of our class. So like if we want to access that name variable, you would just add this definition underscore read write instead of just a normal definition for it. However, if we were to check our class definition again, remember that our name and our hunger were both in the private section of our class. So even though this definition underscore read write would allow us to then in Python take, say if we named a variable p equal to pet whatever, that we couldn't just do p.name equal to Molly or whatever, because it is in the private section of our class definition. So this is how we're going to deal with that. You would use your definition underscore property function, and using that you can actually utilize the other functions within our class, our get name function, and I just included right here a set name function, and instead of just how we would normally initialize the name in the initialization list. So now that we have a set name function and a get name function, we can include those in the def underscore property, and using those we can now set our dot name equal to whatever we would like. So if your data is not in the private section of your class, it's really easy. You will just use the def underscore read write, and then if it is in the private section of your class, you're obviously going to want to use the other functions that you within that class that you would normally use in your C++ file to change those. You're going to use the def underscore property function in your module to change that information.
Okay, so we can move on to our third example here, which is going to kind of deal with how we will handle our private member data here, because we can't just use that read write function on it if it's in the private section of our class. So we have added a set name function here, you can see, in order to change that name of the pet even after we've already given it a name in its initialization. So now if we go down to our binding definition, we'll just move this code down so we can focus on this here. You can see we have our set name defined as well. And now if we use that .def underscore property, we can actually utilize our get name and our set name functions in order to use like that equals operator to change the name even after we've already made that pet in Python. So now if we make that, build it, link it, we open our virtual environment again, and I can just run through the examples that are also on the slides. Import example, and then we create our pet Molly, and then we want to change the name. Well, we'll print the name first so that you guys can see. If we do p.name, you can see that it's easy. You can print it. And then if we do p.name equals Maggie, we're not going to have any errors right there because it's using that def underscore property. So it's not just trying to change the protected data, and the name is changed.
Okay, so we're going to talk about another object-oriented topic of inheritance. And to do that, we're going to make it a little bit easier on ourselves. So if you go in your example.cpp or whatever file you're using and you change your definitions of your pet class, I just created a struct pet that you give a name, and then I created a structure that is a child class of that obviously has a name, and then if it's a dog, I gave it a function that allows it to bark. Okay, so you can see right below here are examples of how to do our inheritance in our binding module. And like I said, again, please follow along within the slides so that you can see this a little bit better. I know it's hard to see on the screen right here, but we can go through that example right now as well.
All right, so for our last example, we're going to talk about inheritance. And as you can see, I've kind of simplified our structs over here. So the pet struct just takes in a name for the pet, and then the dog is a child cat class of pet, and it has the ability to bark. So if we just look down at the binding functions for that underneath our pybind11 module, the definitions are essentially the same as if it were just a normal class, but this is just an inherited class now. We can kind of see how that works within our virtual environment here. So if I make that, and then we do our virtual environment, we import example, and then we'll set p equal to example dot pet Molly, and then we'll make q a dog, right? So if we have our dog bark, that works fine. But if we were to have our pet try and bark, it's not necessarily a dog, so that's gonna give us an error. So that's kind of how the inheritance would work.
All right, so that was my last example. Those are all the topics that I'm just gonna go over in this video. Thank you everybody for watching. And like I said, there's many more topics and more things that you could do with pybind11. That was just all I could get to in this one. So hopefully you basically have a good general understanding of what pybind11 is and the certain things that you can do with it. For more info and more advanced topics and stuff, you can visit that link. That's also linked in that GitHub page that I've told you guys to look at. But that's where I got a lot of my information. They do really good explanations and give really good examples, which hopefully you also found here. So thank you.